Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thanks for being with us today, and sorry for the slight delay in the start of the meeting. My name is Julien, and I work in ECHO D2 in Brussels, in the unit following operations in West and Central Africa, including CAR, and I'm also here with Michael and Evelina, who also cover the region of Central Africa. So we are here today to speak about the situation in the Central African Republic. In the Central African Republic, the needs for emergency assistance are considerable and they are rising. The humanitarian needs overview confirms this trend with a staggering 3.1 million people, more important than euro, representing 63% of the total population expected to be in need of emergency assistance in 2022, which is 300,000 people more than in 2021. Given the magnitude of the needs, it is vital to ensure that the aid delivered reaches its intended beneficiaries and that this is done without compromising the safety of those delivering this aid to humanitarian workers. Now, talking about resources for good. Looking at our most recent support, out of the 21.5 million euro ECHO has mobilized for the humanitarian response in CAR in 2021, funding went in part to support security updates and capacity building on security by INSO. It went also to access through air services provided by UNHAS. Continuation of this funding with both partners in 2022 is currently being considered. Now, zeroing in on the context of CAR, at the bottom of the Human Development Index and mired in conflict since 2013-2014, which is the outbreak of the current crisis, the Central African Republic is characterized by tremendous access challenges, and in particular by transport and telecom infrastructure in very poor conditions. But there is more to explain the limited space that humanitarian partners operate in. The Central African Republic is considered as one of the most unsafe country environments in the world for humanitarian workers. Crime, roadside insecurity by non-state armed groups, obstruction by government armed forces and private military contractors constitute the main threats. The growing use of improvised explosive devices since the first semester of 2021 makes for a new worrying trend. We will now turn to two experts who can elaborate on those two key components of access in CAR, namely logistics and security. We have the pleasure to welcome Ms. Aline Rumonge, who is WFP Deputy Country Director, and who will be focusing on the challenges of logistics in CAR. Mr. Martin Connert, who could not join us today and is replaced by Pierre Vernier, Deputy Country Director for INSO in the Central African Republic. Pierre will speak to the security challenges for humanitarian actors in the Central African Republic. In terms of housekeeping, this meeting will be recorded, and the recording will be accessible on the website of the European Humanitarian Forum, which will be taking place virtually and also physically in Brussels between the 21st and the 23rd of March. Today, we will keep the conversation going with Aline and Pierre through a few questions that we have prepared. We will also open the chat box in WebEx for further questions or comments you may have, which we will pick up in the final part of this session. Please write the inputs you'd like to bring into the conversation in the chat box. Also, please keep your microphones off, except if you are invited to speak. The same goes for the cameras. Please keep them off so as to limit the use of the bandwidth. Overall, this session is to last 45 minutes, so time is of the essence. Let's start now with the first question to Aline. So Aline, What is the outlook for aid delivery in a conflict-affected country like the Central African Republic with very limited transport and communication infrastructure? Is any delivery mode, like delivery through helicopters, river transport, poised to grow if the situation on the ground remains unchanged? Over to you, Aline.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Julien. Thank you. Thanks for your question. And good afternoon, actually. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So, as you know, CAR has been mired in conflict for years with regular spikes. The logistics challenges to deliver humanitarian assistance to the affected community are huge. In addition to the security threat, we have the lack of infrastructure. The few available roads are often not robust enough to support large trucks. In total, listen to me, 25,000 kilometers of roads in CAR, less than 600 kilometers are tarmac, representing only 2.5% of the country's existing road system. Due to the country's wideness, some destination can take up to 10 weeks to reach, which is further hindered by the prevalent insecurity. Also, during the rain season, the roads become more impassable and further hamper the humanitarian community's ability to move and to deliver life-saving assistance. So, also, due to the geographical position of Central Africa, there are significant challenges in the upstream flow of the goods that come in Central Africa. The congestion of the port of Douala, okay, the structural bottlenecks in customs clearances as the Douala corridor, and from which 90% of humanitarian assistance, and especially WFP commodities, are conveyed. So it is really very, very important to diversify the supply chain routes to deliver humanitarian assistance. The use of helicopters, you said it well, Julien. The use of river transport, for example, during last year WFP, we used the Ubangi River, okay, through Pointe Noire. That was to cope with the congestion of Douala Port. Although that corridor have some limit in the use of the river because of the level of the water that becomes lower at certain period of the year. I just talk about the helicopters, the airlift. Of course, when the roads are impassable, for example, the helicopter fleet was used in the west and the northwest, where the armed groups posed improvised explosive devices. Okay. The helicopter is also used, or the airlift of humanitarian assistance under the logistics cluster for the delivery of medicines, which it's faster, yeah, it's faster. And then it's also the services used by all the humanitarian actors in Central Africa. I'm going to stop there and leave our time for questions. Thanks again.
Thank you. So now I suggest that we shift to the security component of access in CAR. So let's move on now to Pierre. I hope you can hear us, Pierre. So what makes the security context in the Central African Republic so specific compared to other countries? I mentioned in my introductory remarks improvised explosive devices, roadside insecurity, crime, disruption by the different forces to different actors to the conflict. These are all security issues that exist elsewhere in the world So is there anything that you'd like to point out which makes the environment for humanitarian workers in CAR distinctively challenging? Over to you, Pierre.
Yeah, thank you for having me today. I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you, Pierre.
Before. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the questions. Great. The particularity for the security context.
Pierre, we cannot hear you anymore. Can you start from over again?
Is linked to a combination of dynamics.
Can the other participants hear Pierre?
The first one is viability.
Pierre, we cannot hear you. I don't know if the other participants can hear you. So what I suggest is that we shift back to Aline, and we will ask the question I asked before to you, Pierre, later on, hoping that the connection will get better. So Aline, talking about logistics again, given the context and the trends that you have just described regarding the means of transport for aid delivery, can new technologies in the areas of information and communication help with aid delivery in a context such as the Central African Republic, for instance, to rationalize the supply chain? Over to you, Aline.
Thank you, Julien. Indeed, yes, it's really a big yes. There is no doubt. Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Aline.
Okay, thank you. So there is no doubt that technology plays a vital role in the world we live in, and the impact it makes on the evolution of the manufacturing industry and supply chain is no exception. So yes, coordinated deliveries, coordinated processes, joint planning across the supply chain could help to respond, to respond to the emergency, or let me say to the unplanned emergency, because there are so many in Central Africa. I hope I responded to your question, Julien. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. So we will try again with Pierre.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. Over to you.
Okay. I will not put the video because I think my connection is not good enough here in Bangui.
Good idea. We can hear you. Please speak on, Pierre.
Okay, great. Just to come back to your question on the securities context and why is it so specific in CAR, we have to consider a few elements. The first one is the variability of the fight on the ground, and also the volatility. And you have to keep in mind also it's very localized. It means in several parts, security issues and security context are very different. For example, in the Northwest, it's more the problem of the explosive device. And I will come back on this. But also in the north, between Markunda, Pawa, and Nanabakasa, it's more the criminality done by the armed groups. On the other side, let's say in the west part, it's very more very much organized around like petty criminality, etc. The key component of this is that the socioeconomic situation is so complicated in the countryside. Then we have like a petty criminality everywhere. So it's done by opportunistic criminals, but it's also done by the armed groups as a survival. The military operation, when they are on, there is no access for the NGO because the FACA and the bilateral forces, their ally, they cut completely the access to those places. So you have to consider all these, let's say, dynamics and tendency into the security context, and also the fact that it's changing very fast and it's changing a lot. To come back on the IED, for us, the majority of the IED are not IED, it's explosive device. In the Northwest, what we've seen, it's conventional landmines that are used by the 3R groups. And on the other part of the country, when we have explosive device incident, it's more like a grenade trap. So you really have to divide in between these two, let's say, practice.
Thank you, Pierre. You were a bit on and off at times. So could you repeat what you said on access cut in some places? Could you mention those places again where access becomes extremely difficult because of limitations that are imposed by the state forces and their allies? Over to you.
Yeah, so for the state forces and their allies, it's every time they have like a, let's say, important military operation. We've seen it in Oyo, Kuchu area. We've seen it in Egbongdo also, north of Bria, and now we see it in between Muka and Wada. So it's very localized. It's very also there is a temporality in it. It means that it lasts for 1, 2, 3 weeks with no access for the NGOs.
Thank you, Pierre. Let's stay with you for another question. How can security information be gathered in a volatile context like the Central African Republic, where access is limited? You spoke to the volatility of the context in CAR. Is engagement with all actors to the conflict, i.e. the FACA, the non-state armed groups, private military contractors, necessary to guarantee that this information, these updates remain comprehensive, accurate, and up-to-date? Over to you, Pierre.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Of course, as an NGO, NGO worker has to discuss with all parties on the ground to reduce the risk and to actually monitor the situation in order not to put their worker into security, bad security situation. I mean, the NGO status with impartiality is very, very important, and also the fact that NGOs work with national people, create like a community of a national NGO worker, and they are able to gather more information than the other because they also live inside the community at night and also during the outside of the working hours. So this is very, very important. The second thing is in CAR, it's possible to discuss with all the actors still. But for example, for the armed groups, since the counterattack of the FACAs and their bilateral allies, starting from the beginning of 2021, the contact with the armed groups is way more difficult than before. Before, we had like what we call com zone and com region. It was people, as an NGO, you could call anytime to say that we are moving on this axe or we are doing an activity in this place. But now, since the counterattack started, all these people, they fled into the bush and the countryside, and they also changed their phone number all the time because they are afraid to be listened by the FACAs and their allied. So engaging with the armed groups now and armed group representative is way more difficult now than it was before. But still, it's possible by an intermediary, let's say. Discussing with the FACA, the gendarmerie, let's say the regular state forces, it's very easy. You just have to show up at their caserne and discuss a little bit, explain what you are doing, which activity you are doing. And I'd say the majority of the time, 90% of the time, they are really willing to discuss and to exchange about security context and security risks around their zone. The last thing is discussing with the FACA's bilateral allies is a bit more tricky. It's possible to have a contact here in Bangui, but
Yeah, Pierre, can you repeat the last thing you were about to say, because we lost you then?
Okay. The engaging a discussion with the bilateral forces, the Russian bilateral forces, is possible in Bangui because they have a representative and we are in contact with this person. But on the field, it's more or less a bit different. Sometimes it goes very well when NGOs worker goes to Russian bases to exchange some information. Sometimes there is no dialogue possible at all. So as for the security issue, it's very localized. In several places, we know that the dialogue is possible. In some others, we know that it's impossible. And it's most of the time change with the commander of these bilateral forces.
Thank you, Pierre. So now moving back to logistics and to Aline, talking about the context again and talking more importantly about the people affected by the crisis and the type of violations that occur in the midst of this crisis. Although internally displaced people and refugees are often the most visible face of the crisis, gender-based violence has taken alarming proportions in the country, especially after the outbreak of the crisis in 2013-2014. Aline, could you elaborate on access constraints and the ramifications those constraints have in terms of gender-based violence? Over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Julien. Thanks again. Yes, I think Pierre did talk about all the access constraints in general in Central Africa. And of course, and indeed, limited access to humanitarian assistance by large, it is a GBV in nature, particularly if it's linked to weapon of war tactics. So humanitarian assistance intend normally to save lives. Therefore, the lack of it or denial of access to humanitarian assistance will lead to death or which the far extend, of course, the GBV, the gender-based violence. The consequences of limited access to humanitarian, including basic needs such as food, water, shelter, access to our farming land, limited access as well to humanitarian assistance, including basic needs. Those basic needs I just named are. Can you hear me? I just
We can hear you, Aline.
Okay.
We can hear you.
So treatment, access to medication within the humanitarian assistance, setting such an IDP or refugee camp would force mainly women and girls to go out of the camp to fetch water, work for food, or sell labor for basic necessities. So the studies have shown that most of GBV, including rapes, are committed on the way back to the camp and to the camp. So limited humanitarian assistance also increases domestic gender-based violence due to trauma and mental health disturbance. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. So now, getting back to the security component of access with Pierre, how does, in your view, work, and based on your experience also, how does collaboration work between NGOs involved in civil-military coordination and the UN peacekeeping forces in the Central African Republic?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I hope you can hear me now better than before. Okay, so the collaboration between the NGOs and the UN peacekeeping forces are done through a few working groups, actually. The first one, of course, is the SIMCORD in Bangui, but also in all the sub-office of OCHA on the field. It's working pretty well, actually, compared to other countries in the world, because it's been years of practice now, and the setup is well done. But there is also several other groups, like in every cluster coordination groups, there is a little component of security. And also due to the widespread deployment of the UN agencies on the ground, it's pretty easy to give and pass message between the NGOs and the peacekeeping forces. Nevertheless, most of the security issues are dealt locally on the ground, yeah, with a sub office of OCHA and UN peacekeepers base in the province. There is only like few example of things that we are following. I mean, for example, last year, an NGO took one armed escort because they were not so sure about one axis and how to move on it. So they took an escort, and 2 or 3 weeks after, the situation was a bit better. I mean, they thought it was better. They took the same axis and had been hijacked by an armed group saying, you use the armed escort from the UN, so now you are UN. So sometimes it's good for the NGO to be clear about this. The NGOs, they use escort only when it's really, really, really needed. I mean, like for a vital logistic supply. But the majority of the time, the NGOs, they move by themselves.
Thank you. Aline, we have one last question on logistics, and participants, we would encourage you also to start writing the questions you may have for the last part of the session, which we'll keep open for 15 minutes for questions and answers between the audience and the speakers. So please start typing in your questions in the chat box of WebEx. But last question for Aline. Localization, meaning the increased reliance on local actors in aid delivery, features high on the policy agenda of the European Commission, but also of other actors. And regarding the Commission, this is particularly in line with the humanitarian aid communication of 2021. Can you give us a quick overview of the role of local actors, including private actors in logistics, in humanitarian aid today in the Central African Republic?
Yes, thank you, Julien. Unlike all other countries, of course, our private sector is a good partner and in delivering humanitarian assistance. They are playing a very important role, particularly with the logistic cluster, with the UNHAS, allowing the NGOs and also UN agencies to carry our humanitarian assistance. So private sector in CAR provides us, of course, with storage capacity, tracking capacity, or we do charter airlines from a local or private company. They provide us any non-food items, yeah, that are required sometimes for shelter, cluster, and all others. So very, very important. Probably not that advanced or developed like in other countries, yeah? But yes, with time, I think the local private sector in car, I think with time we will rely very much on the local or private sector in car. Thank you.
Thank you, Aline. Another question now for Pierre. We've referred before to the specificities of the context in the Central African Republic for humanitarian workers. We know that INSO does not only gather and share information on security, you also aim at the longer term through capacity building. So what are the best practices that you try to promote with the humanitarian organizations that you assist? Over to you, Pierre.
Thanks for the question. Can you hear me? I'm testing every time for every question.
Loud and clear for the time being. Okay,
perfect. So in INSO, for sure, we want the NGOs to be able to deal with themselves about the security. The first thing we offer, it's of course training. We have a training department, and training security, they are for every NGO worker, national, international, I mean expat, inpat, there's no problem for us. We created also training modules around specific position. I mean, there is one for the movement, security of the movement. There is one of the essential security management, advanced management, humanitarian negotiation. So we try to develop several modules that are really needed for the NGO and for every position inside the NGO. The second thing we do, of course, we are doing recommendations about for the preventive measure, I mean, and this is the best way to make sure that the NGO understand it is to repeat it. So we repeat it and repeat all the time the recommendation we give. The relationship, especially with security referent and head of mission, deputy head of mission.
Pierre, can you get back to what you said?
The idea behind
the
this,
last part of your
of course,
reply, because we lost what you said when you started with the subject of recommendations and then you went off. So could you try to start again there?
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. In terms of recommendation, I mean, for the NGOs, we work a lot on prevention. I mean, when you prepare things in advance, usually you reduce the risk. So this recommendation, we repeat them a lot. We repeat them all the time with the idea of the NGOs to integrate it in their security process. The last thing also is the bilateral work relationship with security referent and also with head of mission, deputy head of mission, logistic coordinator. We work with them all the time on phone to give them the good advice at the good moment to be sure they reduce the risk. But the idea really behind the trainings and this repetition of recommendation and bilateral work relationship is to make sure that we transfer the knowledge on security to the NGOs to make sure that they are able to deal with their security issues.
Thank you. So we have slightly more than 10 minutes left for questions and answers, but my colleague Michael is telling me that we do not have yet questions from participants. So please do not be shy and come to us with questions or inputs you'd like to voice. Now is the time. So
there's one comment.
Yeah, we have one comment. Perhaps who is it from?
From Philippe Guiton. The comments say that we hear that the only UN humanitarian helicopter will be ending its service at the end of March due to shortage of funding. well, it's a comment. Maybe you like to add something, Aline, on that regard.
And just on that, before we hand over to Aline, there was a meeting specifically on this a couple of days ago.
The donors meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Aline, do you want to pick up that point specifically on the shortage of funding for the helicopter?
That is correct. That is correct. Maybe to give a quick background, since last year, we took the helicopter. First objective was to be able to do the evacuation related to COVID-19 from the field to Bangui. And then second, of course, to get humanitarian actors where fixed wings cannot reach. So it's expensive to keep a helicopter for that long. So yeah, end of March, we do not have our funding to keep the helicopter. We may, if funds are available, bring another helicopter, which is cheaper than what we have now, but that will be probably during the raining season, raining season, in order to support NGOs that want to provide, assistance for the flooding, during the flooding area. So it's correct. We don't have funding. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. No other question for the time being?
No further questions.
Okay. Perhaps a last question for Pierre. We've mentioned before the growing needs for emergency assistance in the Central African Republic. I mentioned the figures that were given by the humanitarian needs overview for the country in 2022, and the growing needs and the growing number of people in need. We've also pointed to new and unfortunate trends like the use of explosive devices. It's obviously difficult to use a crystal ball to be very accurate on the outlook for the delivery of aid in CAR. But what would you say, Pierre, are your main concerns and priorities regarding the safety of humanitarian workers and partners in 2022?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay. I mean, the main issue for will stay actually the same as 2021. The one very concern, of course, is the explosive devices, because of we don't know exactly where they are, so we never know in advance in which acts they'll be settled. So this is a very, very concerning issue for 2022. At the end of 2021 in INSO, we created several scenarios for 2022, and for now the scenario we are in is the same. It means that nobody loses, but nobody wins. The FACA and the Russian bilateral forces, they don't have enough, let's say, power to take over all the country and to keep it. At the same moment, the armed groups, they are still very mobile, and they can use the dead angle of the, let's say, FACA bilateral forces setup to continue their activities, especially on mines or diamond mines and golden mines, which is a clear financial input for them and a vital financial input for them. So the scenario we are in, the same will continue, but unfortunately for the population of CAR, the socioeconomic situation is degrading slowly.
Thank you, Pierre. So it's the last call for questions or inputs that participants may wish to express now. If so, please raise your hand or speak up. If not, then I suggest that we bring this meeting to a conclusion. So I'll have a few words to conclude. So I think despite the communication challenges that we experienced, especially with Pierre in Bangui, and thanks for being resilient and for trying to cope with these challenges, Pierre from Bangui, this is much appreciated. I think we had a very interesting conversation. I brought down a few points in particular, for instance, the recommendation by Aline that we should aim at diversifying the supply chain routes using different means of transport, fairly new ones, for instance, the use of helicopters or boats on the Ubangi River. Then regarding security, I think that was the very important point made on the specificity of CAR, in that the context remains very volatile, variable, as you put it, Pierre, and it's very localized. So the challenges really differ from one region to another. Also, your point to explain better the threat of not necessarily IEDs, but explosive devices, especially landmines, I think was also very not worthy. Then you explained also how engagement can happen with the different actors to the conflict to better understand what can be the security challenges and hence also ensure more space for humanitarian actors to operate in safety. Also, you spoke to the matter of localization, well, to the fact that engagement this time with private military contractors, again, depends a lot on the location of this engagement. And you said that it varies a lot outside Bangui, and I think it was also a very important point. Aline, you spoke also about gender-based violence, which is a major side effect and very worrying side effect of the conflict, which needs to be addressed by all partners. And you mentioned in particular the necessity to secure the periphery of the camps on gender-based violence, as exposure happens mostly when camp residents are walking to or out of the camps. I also like what you said, Pierre, on the fact that working on prevention, in particular through capacity building and recommendations, is better than acting when the safety risks have materialized. So it's another way to say better safe than sorry. And also your point on transferring the knowledge was well received. And regarding the outlook for 2022, you mentioned also, and that's important to take that with us, you mentioned your concern on the further use of explosive devices and the most likely scenario for 2022 on the status quo, as you put it, nobody loses, nobody wins, but the war economy and the resulting violations go on, unfortunately. So that's something to keep in mind. I'd like to thank our speakers for this very informative conversation. I hope that all the participants found it as interesting as we did here in Brussels. A word of thanks also to the team who helped organize this meeting, including Michael, who is sitting by my side, who is our country officer for CAR in ECHO. And I wish also to mention our colleague Mattia Bordon, who is with us and who was instrumental in the design of this talk. Finally, I wish to end up with a suggestion for everyone to check out the website of the European Humanitarian Forum, as there will be different sessions pertaining to the situation in CAR. For instance, a session to step up action on protection from gender-based violence, or a session on humanitarian civil-military coordination as enabler of international humanitarian law. There will also be a very interesting humanitarian talk, same format as today's meeting, on the stabilization agenda and humanitarian principles in the Lake Chad Basin. So please take a look at the program and register. Thanks again for this talk, and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
Talking. Bye-bye.